Ordinarily on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive, we take whatever's happening in the media at the moment, whatever the headlines are, especially in the hottest areas, whether it's in the Middle East or in the Russia-Ukraine war, and then we'll do a deep dive on it and go into a lot of details, talk about some of the things that's happening on the media, some of the sound bites of some of the players that are involved here, and then we'll give you the context and tell you exactly what's going on and why things are important. And we're going to do some of that today, but we're going to take a bit of a departure here because we have back with us for the first time in a while Captain Matthew Ho, her former captain anyway, senior fellow, Eisenhower Media Network, also a former State Department official and highly decorated combat Marine in Iraq. I mean, you've really got the whole gamut here covered. But first of all, even before we get anything else, Matt, absolutely welcome back. A hearty welcome.
Well, thanks, Danny. It's good to see you guys. Good to be back here with you and Gary. Yeah, I wasn't highly decorated, by the way. But I appreciate
I mean, it depends on your perspective. I mean, it may not have been a Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was still pretty high. You know, for those who may not know, we've had a lot of folks who've joined our channel here in the last number of months. Some of whom may have joined after you were a regular on the channel. Hopefully, we'll get back into doing that real soon. But folks are in for a real treat today because Matt has got this tremendous breadth of experience, not merely knowledge, and everywhere from like I said, the State Department. So he understands how the government stuff works on the ground in a civilian operation status, especially in Afghanistan. Also on the ground as a combat Marine company commander, engineer in Iraq, in some of the hottest parts of that fight. So you really do bring a breadth of knowledge and experience, and then you just got great common sense too. So really looking forward to this one. But before we get into the news of the day, because we're going to be talking about a lot of things that are going on in the Middle East with the Gaza operation that Israel is undertaking now. And before we get into that, though, you actually you have a new thing to add to and that's kind of like, I don't know, movie star maybe going a little bit too far, but you're in a documentary that's out right now called Bodyguard of Lies. And I'm going to show you a clip of that in just a minute. But before we do, I wonder if you can just kind of give us a little bit of hint as to what this is about and how you became a part of it.
Sure. Bodyguard of Lies is a Paramount film, so it's available on Paramount Plus to stream. It's produced by Alex Gibney, directed by Dan Krauss. People who are media, particularly documentarian buffs, will recognize those names. It is based upon the Afghan Papers. If people recall, in 2019, the Washington Post produced an expose on documents that they had received from the U.S. government. Those documents were the interviews of hundreds of American officials who had taken part in the Afghan war, whether they be military, diplomatic, political, intelligence, development, whatever. And in those documents, in those interviews, these were interviews that weren't supposed to ever see the light of day. These officials, one after another, essentially said this war was unwinnable. We didn't have a chance to win it. We all knew it, but we all went along with it. And so the Afghan Papers, of course, connecting that title to what Dan Ellsberg did with the Pentagon Papers, the reporter at the Washington Post, Craig Whitlock, he produced a book, and then this film is based upon his book. And essentially the film, it's a great introduction, particularly for those who are not so familiar with the Afghan war or maybe have forgot. But it generally, in 90 minutes, they touched on how every aspect of that war was deceitful. And the other night, Danny, I was thinking about this. I was trying to think of one thing, sincerely think of one aspect of the war that wasn't manipulated or dominated or shaded, so heavily by lies and mendacity. And I really couldn't, including the casualty counts, which we can get to in a little bit if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, and of course we see a lot of this, and I'm guessing that once we come out of this clip here in a minute, that we'll be able to see some direct correlations of what's going on in the Russia-Ukraine war, all the stuff that the West is doing, all that, and in the Israeli, I guess you could call it Middle East war, because you can't just say Hamas, because it's so much bigger than that, as events of just the last few hours demonstrate. It goes far beyond just the borders of Gaza. But without any further ado, here is one clip from the documentary.
Coming up, come on. Right there. Go. Coming up, come on.
officials were under pressure to report only good news. So you look on the latest assessment report, and you see, well, that district, it's colored that we control it. But you go out to these small little outposts, and there'd be a lieutenant, you know, so a kid who's 23, 24, 25 years old, and he'd have 30 or 40 American troops, maybe about the same amount number of Afghan troops, maybe less. And you'd ask them, what part of this district do you control? And they'd say, I can control what's in the line of sight of my machine guns. You know, that'd be it. And you'd hear that over and over and over again. And you saw the impossibility of the tasks put to the US and NATO troops.
Man, I'll just tell you, just from my own personal experience, I had 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, for those who may not know. And that one part you were talking about you control the line of sight of your machine gun is nearly verbatim what I had when I went into actually a number of places. I traveled all throughout the country on the ground, and I'll never forget one in the Kunar province, which I don't know for sure where some of that video was shot, but a lot of it looked very similar along the Pakistan border. And I went to the northernmost area where the United States had control, and we were going on a very narrow little path in our MRAP troops vehicles. Then we got to the path got too narrow, so we had to get out and go the rest of the way on foot. And I asked the lieutenant the exact same question, because from the position we were at, you could see all the way, you know, numerous mountain ranges deeper into Afghanistan. You look the other way on the other side of the Kunar River, and you could see all into Pakistan, etc. And I said, how much of this territory do we control? And he says, at first he said about 100 meters on either side of the road. And then he actually said, well, actually, we don't actually control that, but we have observation on it. So we control the road only. So I can absolutely validate the complete accuracy of what that happened here in this image here. But what are some of the bigger takeaways of this, and why did you participate in it?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that, look, let me take a step back. When people would ask me, Danny, about the Afghan war, about the Iraq war, what books should they read? I always would say, read Best and the Brightest by David Halberstam and Neil Shaheen's A Bright Shining Lie, right? 2 books about Vietnam. And I said, if you read those 2 books about Vietnam, you will understand the Afghan and the Iraq wars, you know, from the American perspective, why we're doing this, why we continue it, you know, that type of thing. And I think that's what you take away from this, the universality of the war, that this may be specific to Afghanistan, but this can be applied to all of America's interventions, occupations, wars of our lifetimes. You know, essentially, I mean, for one point, it's the same people involved over and over again, but the structures, the institutions, the incentives of the war. And because the wars are built upon these illegitimate foundations, that they're built upon policies that simply can't work. They're built upon narratives that aren't true. Well, then you have to, but the incentives to continue the war are so good, whether they be political, whether they be, you know, economic and financial, whether they be career, whether it be for the institutions, that the wars continue. And that's a lot of what this documentary touches on. And the director, Dan Krauss, did an incredible job putting it all together and getting a lot of information in the space of 90 minutes to just show how there really isn't a good thing to point to. You know, a lot of things were left out, you know, the drug trade, things like that were left out because there's simply not enough time to get to that. But, you know, you look at this and you have to walk away with the reality of it, that there was no good aspect of it. There's nothing you could point to and say, this made sense, or this was worthwhile, or this produced a result that gave us, the United States, some sort of benefit. And then you go and you move forward and you look at the wars that follow it, whether it be Libya, whether it be Syria, whether it be the war in Ukraine, the genocide in Gaza, the Red Sea, you know, one after another. And you watch this film and you say, oh, hey, this makes sense. I can see how through our policies and the incentives of the war that this inertia just continues this war making. So it may look different. We don't have 100,000 troops on the ground and 100,000 contractors and 40,000 NATO troops like we did in Afghanistan someplace, but everything else around it is more or less, the same type of structure.
So a couple of things I want to tell you, just from watching these the images here stream past on our screen there from the trailer, you see Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden. I mean, it spanned all of their times in office. So this is not a left-right thing. This is not a conservative liberal thing. Why would there not be any, I guess, retribution or corrective when another administration comes in, like there is in some other topics here? Why did it continue on seamlessly between administrations?
And the same pattern emerges. So Obama takes over from Bush, and Obama escalates the war. Then he says he's going to get out, and he doesn't, right? Trump takes over from Obama, escalates the war, right? Then he says he gets out, and he doesn't, right? And then Biden comes in, and for reasons we could talk about, ultimately decides to get out, does it in a terribly ham-handed fashion. But I think there's a couple of things. One, that the politics of it, being a strong commander-in-chief, being a better commander-in-chief, and then by extension, that attribute passing down through your party. So the Democrats are better at war than the Republicans are better at war than the Democrats. That is such a delicious political stance to take, right? They can't turn away from it. They love it. And then the other side of that is that now they're stuck, and they get out. It's the converse of that, or the inverse of that. Well, if you get out, now you're going to be seen as weak. And so that happens over and over again, where the presidents and their parties think this is going to make us look strong. It's going to make us look tough. We're going to be better warriors than the other guys. And then they're stuck. And then all the incentives, right? All the institutionalized and even individual reasons for the war to continue, the amount of money that was being made, the fact that you have a mindset, a worldview within the foreign policy circles of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that's near identical. I mean, if anyone wants to explain to me the difference between a Democratic liberal interventionist and a Republican neoconservative, please feel free to do so in the comments, because I'd love to explain, right? I mean, what's ultimately the difference between an Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, or a Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio? What is ultimately the difference? Yes, so the Democrats tend to be more polished at times. They speak highly of international institutions and international law, respect for human rights. Their actions completely betray that narrative that they put forward, and the Republicans just choose not to go along with the narrative, not speak that narrative. But their actions, they're mostly the same. And so the worldview, the mindset of the people who are involved here, I mean, so that's why you see these administrations essentially doing the same thing and being committed to American warfare, and this gets back into larger things we can talk about the need for American primacy, whether that was established after the Second World War or established after the end of the Cold War. There's plenty of documents coming out of the Truman administration, the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration that show that primacy, dominance is the American strategy globally. In 1947, George Kennan says to Harry Truman, Mr. President, the United States, we've got less than 5% of the world population, but we have like 55% of the world's wealth. And it's going to be the duty and obligation of every successive president to maintain that imbalance, right? I mean, and so understanding that outlook, understanding that responsibility of office for the president, if you will, you see how one administration after another, Democrat, Republican, since the end of the Second World War, we can talk about prior to that, because there's certainly things to talk about then. But, in the modern era, the last 80 years, we see the same escapades, the same misadventures, the same inept meddling occur over and over with deadly and catastrophic consequences.
And one of the absolute essential non-negotiable enablers of that system to perpetuate is a compliant media. And again, whether Republican, Democrat, whether one leans right or leans left or hard right, they all have to cooperate and work together so that when these officials, whether it's the slick Anthony Blinkens or the less slick but tougher like Mike Waltz types, et cetera, all those during the Bush administration, they just repeat and write down whatever these officials say, and there's so little actual analysis is done underneath it. Or people say, for example, I'll just pick one out of many. I want to say it was February 2013. General Allen was having a change of command ceremony where he was going to pass on to his successor. And as he passed on the guide on to him, he said, to the audience, this is what winning looks like. We should not shy away from it. This is winning. And they handed the guide on to him. And for some reason, there was very little, if any, actual pushback to people saying, WTF, this does not look like winning. What is your definition of winning? Because there's no change between the time you took that guide on until the time you're handing it back, or indeed a decade before that. And yet that's what they do. How do you explain that, especially somebody who works in the media?
Well, first of all, in the film, there's I don't want to call it great. It's sad and tragic and makes you want to get up and get the bottle out of the cabinet, montage of one general after another saying exactly that, and I remember in 2011 or 2010 or sometime like that, writing a piece where I went back and looked at all the different commanding generals in Afghanistan since 01 and 8 or 9 at that time. Every one of them, it was easy to find a quote being like, we're winning. This is what winning looks like. We're making progress. We're light at the end of the tunnel, just some more time, some more troops, and we'll, be home by Christmas kind of thing. And, the fact is the media hears that over and over again, and they accept it, so willingly, right? They accept it so earnestly. And, the media is part of the larger establishment. They're part of the ruling class. They are part of, our friend Ray McGovern. He doesn't call it the military industrial complex. He calls it the Mickey Mat, which, let me see if I can get it. The military intelligence, congressional, media, academic think tank, and right. I mean, it's all part of the same ecosystem, and they're all friends. They all go to the same cocktail parties. They go to the same Christmas parties. They've gone to the same schools. Their kids marry each other. I mean, this is the elite of the country. And they sit on the same board of directors. And so what's good for Time Warner is good for Exxon Mobil, which is good for Raytheon and Northrop Grumman, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that macro aspect of it. On a kind of more individual or lower level aspect, I think it really is a carrot and stick aspect, a fear of being left out. I'll tell you a story. I know you got your stories too, Danny, about this, in 2009, after I resigned, Dan Rather interviews me, and they bring me up to New York. And, we spend 3 hours. I spent 3 hours getting interviewed by Dan Rather while we're shooting B-roll in Midtown, on the streets of Midtown. He's talking to me about this. And he says, I know you're right about Afghanistan because I've been going there for 3 decades, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As I'm leaving, his producer comes up and says, hey, I just got this email from Central Command, General David Petraeus' command at the time. And essentially the email said, if you are the type of organization that wants to work with someone like Matt Ho, then we don't think you are the right people for us to work with. And about, 3 weeks later, this big Dan Rather special on Afghanistan airs, hour-long thing. I am nowhere to be seen in that hour-long, news special. However, there's Dan Rather's correspondent flying around in a helicopter in Afghanistan with Stan McChrystal, right?
Holy
and we heard that story over. So I could tell you the same story from ABC News. I
was going to tell you that I'd never heard that story of yours before, and I have nearly the identical one when I came out with my report in February 2012. Initially, I was on CNN and several other networks, and then the biggest one came a couple of days later. I was invited to ABC News. And so I did the same thing. I went downtown in Washington, D.C., sat down with Martha Raddatz, an A-lister person who's one of the anchors or whatever. And we're talking about it. She asked me some hard questions on Petraeus. And I said, straight up, here's the truth. I don't care what anybody says otherwise here. And before I left the room, someone came into and said something to I guess it was the producer, somebody who was producing the segment. And he said, okay, I think that's good. I think we're good to go on this. And I walked out and said, well, will this air tonight? And he goes, we'll see. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow night. Never saw the light of day because I don't know who sent something over. I was required, because I was still on active duty at the time, I was required to clear everything through the public affairs office before I could do anything. So obviously it seems likely, at any rate, that they got on the phone with somebody and said, just deep six this. Never saw the light of day. I was supposed to go on one of the primary shows for CNN about a week or so after that, right before I was supposed to show up at the studio. That got canceled. So a lot of that going on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's access journalism, and now you see it getting even worse with this regime that's in power. You know, last week, are we calling him Secretary of War? Is that the right way?
That's the public way to do it. Yeah,
that's Secretary of War. The sow, like I said, female cow, right? You know, like
maybe I want to rethink that one.
Right? You know, I mean, like, so anyway.
Oh, the war pig, man.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pig. Classic.
Yeah.
I guess it's sow. I'm
from New Jersey. You're from Texas. You know it's better than me. I guess a sow's a pig, right? Not a cow. Yeah. So like, So anyway, but
oh boy.
You know, I mean, they said last week, the Pentagon, that, you know, that journalists will lose their credentials if they publish anything that's not pre-approved by the Pentagon. I mean, this is a big deal. I mean, this is
huge.
A huge deal. Huge. And then today, the Post had an article about how they're flying back all these generals and admirals, hundreds of them, for an address by the Secretary of War. You know, and I imagine that is essentially a get in line or retire type of speech he's going to give them. But, you know, you look at this institution, the War Department, and, you know, you can understand how you get to a point when there has been no checks or balances on it. When, you know, Jim Mattis, when he was Secretary of Defense, significantly cuts the amount of reporters who travel with him and puts restrictions on reporters that they hadn't seen in years, even going back to the George W. Bush administration. And the media still celebrates him as Mad Dog Mattis. And oh, what a real, you know, the scholar saint, salt of the earth. The troops love him. You know, I mean, like that type of thing. When there's not that type of adversarial reporting, when there's certainly, you can't expect it from Congress. You know, if anyone has ever watched a House Armed Services Committee hearing or Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, I mean, it's as if these congressmen and women and senators are like bobblehead dolls, just nodding up and down in agreement with what the generals and admirals are saying. I remember one time meeting with Jack Reed. At that time, I can't remember if Reed was the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee or the ranking member of Senate Armed Services Committee at the time. I can't remember who was in power in the Senate. But anyway, talking to him about Afghanistan, and had like an hour and a half long conversation with the guy. And he seemed to understand everything I was saying. It wasn't like the first time he was hearing this, seemed to agree with me on many things. And as I'm walking out, his staffer says to me, yeah, we understand that there's a real wide gap between the reality on the ground there and what the Pentagon is saying about the war. But we don't feel it's our place to get involved. Right? You know, I mean, it's just that type of.
It's not your place to be involved.
Right. You are exactly. Literally, that's the Constitution. This is what, according to the Constitution, you ought to do, provide oversight. And same thing when I met with Ike Skelton. This was in March of 2010. So we have been in Afghanistan for what, 8.5 years at that point. And I go in, and at that point, Skelton was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, right? The senior most member of Congress to provide oversight on the U.S. military for the American people. And Skelton talked to him for however long, 45 minutes, whatever. He thanks me as I'm leaving. He says to me, you know, I really appreciate you coming in. That's the first negative briefing I've ever received on the Afghan war. In March of 2010, the House Armed Services Committee chairman says to me, he's essentially never heard a negative briefing on the Afghan war. And he doesn't think to do anything about it. Like I'm some nut job that came off the street, right? You know, I mean, who just somehow wandered in his office and spouted all these negative things about Afghanistan that have never been said before. You know, I mean, so it's that type of the complicity of the media and the Congress enabled a war like Afghanistan to go on for 20 years. And then specifically things that the U.S. military did to hide the war that, again, the Congress and the military went along with, so that by the time you get—
I had a few years later than your experience there. Oh, no, actually it was maybe a couple of years before. Now that I think about it, 2008, I was in the Future Combat Systems program at Fort Bliss, Texas. And for those who may not know, that used to be the premier modernization program the United States Army was going to do to bring itself into the future and, go past the legacy that won Desert Storm and, leapfrog everybody into the future. And they had all of this high-tech stuff and all this. And so I was sent to that. Now, I had combat experience in armored warfare in Desert Storm. So I had a pretty good idea of how things actually worked. And I had some, was really eager to be part of what was going to go into the future, like very eager. Then I get in there and find out that it was almost all smoke and mirrors, all these things that they're doing, when I can see on the ground all this systems that are being tested, experimentation. I'm talking field experimentation, not even just simulation. But everything that we were doing was designed to come to a certain end. And even that was failing because the systems weren't working together. And yet they told each other that it was. Well, it turns out I got to know as a part of the one of the congressional investigation. Maybe a CRS. I can't remember. One of these organizations is tasked to do investigations for Congress so that they can see what's going on. They sent a team down, and every year they did an estimate on the future combat systems, which was almost always routinely negative, saying the same things that I'd saw, and they had recommendations. Well, I get to meet those guys because I'm in the program. Turns out that they said, listen, what happens every year? Because I asked him, how is this dichotomy between what you're saying every year in public? I mean, you print these things, and then all of a sudden when the generals go before Congress, it's like 180 degrees opposite. Everything's working great. And he said, because what happens is before the hearing, the generals will then go into the members of Congress or to the Senate members, and then they'll have this really congenial conversation, and they'll tell them what they're going to ask. They'll tell the generals will tell them what they're going to answer. Everybody pats each other on the back, and then they go out and just performative. No one asks any hard questions. It's not expected, and no one gives any answers besides that which is approved. And I was just dumbfounded. And of course, 1 year later, about 18 months later, the program is canceled for many of the reasons that I had identified in some of my articles, things that I have written, et cetera. Some said a lot of the stuff that the organization had published year after year, and it just wasted a full decade. We never, by the way, replaced that. There is no future combat system to this day. We still don't have a modernization program because these things keep existing, but the money keeps flowing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the no one wants to tell the boss that he's wrong. Nobody wants to put forward bad news. That's not the way you're going to get promoted. I mean, you saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan all the time. I remember one time looking into Crete where we had a massive car bomb blow up next to the division headquarters and knocked out the windows for a lot of the division headquarters. A bunch of Iraqis were killed. And this was like however many times we had a car bomb, a suicide bombing like that in the last few weeks. And I remember the division commander losing it, because the brigade commander who had authority, who had responsibility for Tikrit, his assessment was that things were going well in Tikrit. If people aren't familiar, the U.S. military, I don't know how it is now. Of course, before we were in love with PowerPoint slides. If you were an airborne unit, there were guys jumping in with a Proxima projector, strapped to their chest, kind of thing, right? I mean, it was crazy how much the U.S. military lived and died by PowerPoint. But anyway, you had this traffic light system that was in the clip that you showed, Danny. That's what I'm referring to when I said the assessment is colored, right? So red to green and then shades in between of that's to tell you how things are going. So whether or not how much ground you control, enemy activity, whatever, this red to green system with shades along the way. And I remember, that day, the general losing it, General Toluta losing it, because this, literally this car bomb had just blown up next to his headquarters. And the assessment for the area showed like a light green, kind of thing. And that was the case, everything will get bumped. I mean, whatever, even if someone put in an honest assessment, tell you a story from Afghanistan, we got these radio towers put in. the idea with the radio towers were that the local Afghan officials were going to talk to the local population via the radio, right? And we're losing the information war, the media war, the PR war, the propaganda war to the Taliban, because their way to handle it was just send 2 dudes on a 60cc motorbike village to village and tell them what's going on. You know, but we're going to build these radio towers, cost millions of dollars. American contractors got fat and rich off of it, everything else. These things got installed. But the problem was there was no fuel to run the generators for the towers. There was no recording equipment to allow for the Afghan government officials to record stuff and then broadcast. There were no radios. The Afghan people themselves didn't have any radios, you know, and several other things that it can't work, you know, particularly they don't have radios. And I wrote that all up. And what I saw, what went from the embassy back to Washington, D.C. was a good news story about how all these radios have been installed, you're right, and we're ready to start working and telling our side of the story, and we are about to win the information operations side of this war, right? When they couldn't work at all. We couldn't use them. We couldn't turn them on. We had no fuel. We couldn't record stuff to put on them. The Afghans, again, the big thing, they didn't have radios, you know, but don't let that stop a good news story. You know, I mean, and so you saw that over and over again. You know, everyone who was in that war, it worked on some staff level, knows exactly what I'm talking about. And it became part of the system. And, you know, you go along to get along. And, you know, and that's how guys got promoted. That's how, I mean, you would see this over and over again. I mean, the big one on that was I was in Tikrit working with 1ID when General Petraeus, and he had the 101st or 82nd up in Mosul. I can't remember which, but you know, his reports about how fantastic things were up in northern Iraq in Mosul were so good. It's so positive up there. Wow, Petraeus and his guys have done such a great job. We don't need to send a full division up to northern Iraq and to Mosul and Tel Afar and all those places. We could just put an armored cavalry regiment up there. We don't need that. And that's what they did. They put, I think it was 3rd ACR. Yeah, right. And it went to, as soon as they got there, they realized they didn't have enough folks. And it was only a matter of time before the whole thing exploded, like anyone would tell you it would. Yeah. But in fact, you know, I mean, right. And promoted.
In fact, I noticed in that montage that we saw there, the image of Petraeus, and I want to kind of bring this all forward into why this all matters still today. And that's the great transition. So you have the collusion here and what I'm about to explain between senior military commanders, members of Congress, and the media. It takes all three to perpetuate this. And so let's take Petraeus. So there's the things you're talking about right there. Well, when I published my truth-telling piece in February 2012, the New York Times covered it. You know, officer becomes a whistleblower, et cetera. I laid out in detail.
Front page above the fold, too. It was a big story. It was a big story. Yeah.
It was for a while. It was. Yeah. Now, so first of all, when that came out, it just so happened timing was fortuitous in that the ground commander, a 3-star General Scaparrotti, was in the Pentagon. He was visiting from out of town. So, of course, cameras went straight to him. I think it was either later that same afternoon when it came out or maybe the first thing the next morning. And they said, what do you think about this assessment, the Davis system, which is completely contradictory to yours? And he said, well, you know, I hear that. I mean, that's just one person's view. I have this bigger comprehensive view where I can see it. And we're pretty confident that our assessment is actually correct. But I hear what he's saying. And so the media goes, okay, anyway, moving on to the next question. So that ended that point right there. In my report, though, I chronicled in detail a lot of things that Petraeus specifically had said where he was lying to the American public going back to, I think it was March 2010, when he first started telling everybody that the surge was working, that this new strategy was having benefit, that they were changing the azimuth. Now things are on the right track. We now have the inputs right, all those things, right? And so we know that obviously it wasn't. It never did. The whole thing ended in complete and total disaster. In August of 2021, when we had the botched withdrawal that you referred to, who's the first person the media turns to for an explanation of why it went bad? But David Petraeus, right? So now then we fast forward into this war here. In May 2023, So literal days before the Ukraine were to start their offensive operation, where they were going to try to drive Russia back to the Azov coast, cut off the land bridge, and maybe set the conditions in the next year to completely drive Russia out of all of Ukraine. That was the big hope. David Petraeus went on BBC. I've shown this clip many times on our show, where he laid out in extraordinary detail, not just said they were going to win, but said why they were going to win, that the Russian army would crash, crumble, and possibly collapse, was the statement that he made. And he said all these reasons why it was going to happen. Well, obviously the exact opposite happened. And it was the Ukraine side that broke its teeth very predictably on the Russian lines, which had been talked about. We had talked about it in months before that. I'd written a bunch of stuff. Anyone who's looking at it honestly could have seen that. But instead of accepting that, now then, just days ago, here again, I have to show another David Petraeus saw it, to where he's in this big conference in, I think it was in Finland, where all these muckety mucks are meeting. And he talked about in the clip about all these different organizations he's briefing and people he's advising and all this. They keep putting the microphone in front of his face, even though he was catastrophically wrong in Afghanistan, even worse, catastrophically wrong on this war. And yet, Matt, they keep listening to him. Make that make sense to me.
He understands the system. He understands how it works. His thesis at Princeton, where
okay, fine that he understands that, but how come the system keeps putting the guy back out there knowing that he's wrong?
Again, I think they're all interconnected, right? These are all the same people at the cocktail parties. These are all same people who have maintained the same interests. You know, Petraeus is at Stanford, I believe. I forget which university he's at, right? I mean, the same thing. You go to Columbia and you've got Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton and Mike Pompeo there, right? You know, I mean, you look at what's his day job. He's, you know, or one of his day jobs, he's on the board of directors for KKR, the big, right, investment firm. I mean, so they maintain these relationships, this symbiotic existence. And because if they go to someone else, well, that's not really they lose the self-interest. So why are they going to go to someone who may have been right or accurate, particularly when it upsets a long-standing narrative that they've had, or it forces them to have to issue some form of correction about how they got things wrong in the past? So for a lot of different reasons, mainly self-interest, they stick with a guy like Petraeus because he's one of theirs. They know he's going to stick with the script, right? It's not going to cause them any discomfort. And because he's so well connected that he continues to be able to provide them with things that they want in terms of access and everything else. So it really is. It's nothing more than self-interest that keeps him going. I mean, we can get into the larger cultural aspects of it. I mean, he is well known. He's probably the most well-known American military commander since the Vietnam War. And that was all planned. He knew exactly what he was doing. You know, go back to Creed again. When I was with 1ID, the guy, the three generals, I heard these guys ripping on him all the time. And that was really odd to hear generals speak unprofessionally of other generals. When Petraeus would fly up from Baghdad, when he was in charge of, at that point, Minstiki, which was the training command for the police and the Iraqi police and the Iraqi army. And this is also when he lost, 300,000 weapons went missing, all went into the hands of the death squads and everything. You know, that's a whole other story. But Petraeus was never held accountable for that, for losing hundreds of thousands of weapons. But they would rip on him and they would say things like, make sure Petraeus is coming today. Make sure he lands at the large LZ because he's going to have those 2 helicopters full of journalists with him. You know, make sure there's like 2 extra rows of chairs set out for the staff meeting today because Petraeus is coming. So all the photographers are going to be here as well. You know, they'd say, because that's who he was. And he got it. And in what was it? Summer of 04, summer of 05, where he was on the cover of, was it Newsweek? Is this the man who can win the war in Iraq? You know, you go to have the guy who gets associated by the American public with the American military, particularly Iraq. You go from that catastrophe of that war to the fact that in 07, 08, he's flipping the coin at the Super Bowl, right? You know, I mean, so there is just, I think, that the paucity of understanding of the wars that is a direct result of Congress and the media's inaction in all this, their complicity with the deceit of the wars, allows for a guy like Petraeus, who's arguably as much responsible for the catastrophe of that war as anyone else, to end up flipping a coin at the Super Bowl. And people,
yeah, and look, as we're talking here, I was looking up at this. Look, this is on the page here. This is on, this is the Stanford Law School page here. Talks about all these things he's done. He's been on KKR since 2013, the Global Institute, et cetera. And then you get down here to the bottom. Since 2013, he's been a Judge Whitley professor at the University of Southern California, a personal venture capitalist, senior vice president, Royal United Services Institute. Additionally, he's a member on the boards of the Institute for the Study of War. We talk about that one a lot. The Atlantic Council, Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and over a dozen veteran service organizations. So that, I mean, directly confirms exactly what you just said there, that this is an incestuous pool, that they're all tied together. And with that many places, no one cares if he's right or not, as long as he says the words that they want to hear.
Yeah, no, it's to maintain the status quo, right? Maintain the status quo. And I don't know if you saw this, but earlier this week, he interviewed Ahmed al-Sharar, the Al-Qaeda boss in Syria now, right? You know, and Petraeus' comments to him, he had two that really stuck out to me. One, Petraeus said to Sharar, I'm a big fan of yours. And the other is, your success is our success. God. Right? You know, I mean, like, it's just
a big fan.
Big fan, and your success, Mr. Al-Qaeda, is our success. Right? You know, I mean, so that's the type of people we're dealing with here. You know,
so let me show you this recent comment that he just made here regarding the Russia-Ukraine war, and let me see what you think on the backside of this.
You have just come back from a trip to Kyiv, Paris, Brussels, and Warsaw. How is the war effort going from your check-in?
Well, actually, we were also in Kyiv a few months ago for I think that was the Kyiv Security Forum. This was the Alta-European Strategy Group, but also visiting with units that I've been tracking all along, including especially the Nemesis Regiment, which is one of the premier unmanned services units. In fact, I drove their maritime drone 100 kilometers an hour. It's quite spectacular. And I actually felt better after this trip to Kyiv for some reason. The Ukrainians, I think, are in a better place relative to the U.S. and to NATO and the Western world.
You feel better about them now than you did before. And he mentioned, just like that thing I just showed you about all the groups that he's in. He went to all Paris, Brussels, all these big places. I mean, what do you do with that, Matt? I mean, talk to me first of all on the substance of what he said. Is there any rational basis to say that things are better for Ukraine now than they have been?
No, there's not. I mean, certainly the shift in American president's perspective on this is a big deal for Ukraine. I think that's something that many of us were expecting. I mean, you look at the Trump statements at the UN General Assembly the other day, and you look at who was there in the front row for the American delegation. It was Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and Mike Waltz, the UN Ambassador. And all those three guys who presumably
Kellogg too, by the way, he was there as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but like, you know, those are the guys that he turns to for this. And I think that's what a lot of us were afraid of with regards to Trump, was that he's going to come in, he's going to think he's going to have a deal, he's going to yell at the Russians, they're not going to respond the way he wants them to. And then all these people who are very anti-Russia, just to put it simply like that, around him are going to say, look, Mr. President, you gave it a good try, but you're like, we told you, these people won't listen. The only thing the Russians understand are force and blah, 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 blah. I think there's also two larger geopolitical shifts underway here where Trump doesn't see the need for Russia as he maybe once did. Maybe he once saw Russia with all its commodities, not just its oil and gas, but, you know, if something comes out of the ground that mankind can use, Russia has it, you know, and they're probably like the top 3 producers of it in the world. Like that's why going on a war against this country is so insane, you know. But you know, it's like, that's why they're so hyped up about Venezuela, right? And that's the way they're so hyped up about other parts of Latin America. Maybe they don't need Russia to be on our side resources wise, because we're going to take the Venezuelan oil and in the minerals out of South America. So, you know, I mean, go on a tangent there, but you know, there's nothing you can look at that would say that things are okay for Ukraine. I mean, particularly as come to have you know, this understanding of the Russian war plan. I've actually been doing I went to Spain this summer. We talked about that. I've done a lot of reading about the Spanish Civil War, and the Russian war plan is similar in many ways to the nationalist war plan during the Spanish Civil War, where it's about eradicating the opposition, eradicating the other side, a war of attrition, which is, I know you guys have been saying for years now, you know. I mean, so the failure to understand what Russia is trying to obtain here, its objectives, but also the way it's going to go about achieving those objectives, you know, puts us in a position where you can have someone like Petraeus say, well, look, the Ukrainians are in a good position. The Russians really aren't making that much. You know, they've been trying to take Pokrovsk for a year now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? You can make all kinds of arguments that sound really good, but are specious about how the Russians are ultimately just days away or weeks away or months away from collapse. And so you can have a interview happen like where you saw with Petraeus, where he says they're in a good place because they've got these really great high-speed drone boats and everything else. And the interviewer goes along with it because everything in the media space for the last few years has been the constant drumbeat that Russia is weak, it's hollowing itself out, it's only days away or weeks away or months away from collapse. Right. I mean, like, and when that is the same talking point, when that is the narrative that's used consistently for years, there is no way a major interviewer, a major media network, or anyone else is going to say, well, we got to reverse this whole narrative. I just happened one time to me, Danny, had a very senior, very big journalist call me, New York Times writer. Well, I think the only time the Times ever called me, and asked me about safe havens in Afghanistan and about if Obama gets out of Afghanistan, or maybe it was Trump. I can't remember when this happened, but if they get out of Afghanistan, what's going to happen? Isn't Al-Qaeda going to go right back there? And 9/11 is going to happen right away. Another 9/11 is going to happen right away. And I said, no, the safe haven argument is a myth. It's a fallacy, right? I mean, first of all, as you kind of said earlier, when you were there, and I had the same thing. I remember flying to Jalalabad my first time out of Kabul and just seeing all the valleys. You know, and like for every valley we were in, there were 25 that we weren't. How are we going to guarantee the country? And then, you know, at the point I make the film, you know, how much space do you need to train for a hijacking? I mean, they could train for hijacking in my backyard. You know, I mean, you don't need, right? I mean, so the whole idea.
And a lot of 9/11 was done in Florida, in Maryland, in Germany.
Exactly. That's I know Scott Horton says it all the time. The most important safe havens for the 9/11 hijackers were the flight academies that they went to in the United States. You know, I mean, so as I said this to him, he said, oh, hang on, stop. I can't use that. I understand what you're saying, but that's going to require me to write a whole piece explaining how our narrative has been wrong for all these years. And I just can't do that. You know, I mean, like, so they're, you know, you look at that thing where we're 3.5 years into this war. You would think that the interviewer would stop Petraeus and say, but General, come on, we've heard from people like you over and over again that things are getting better for Ukraine. It's the same thing you said about Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and so forth and so on, you know, but they won't do it. They won't do it. You know, I mean, so, and Petraeus would never go someplace where he'd be asked that question.
Of course. So, yeah. So, he didn't come on our show yet. I don't know why.
I know. You did have Ben Hodges on your show though one time.
It did have him on. I'm pretty sure he won't ever come back. But
I doubt it. But like, yeah.
we treated him very nicely and respectfully. We didn't trash him, but we did talk about the truth. Listen, in the amount of time we have left here, I want to kind of bring all this forward into seeing, you know, okay, that's ancient history. That's Afghanistan war, et cetera, all the stuff that you're talking about in there. Or even
but we may be, Danny, we may be going back. Trump said the other day that we're going to take Bagram.
Wants to take my old headquarters at Bagram. That's where I used to be headquarters. So yeah, I'll see if I can get my old digs back. But separate, we'll discuss that on the next episode. But let's look in the Middle East. And so we're not going to go on a big tour here. We don't have a whole lot of time left. But let's see. Do you see any of these same proclivities that you saw in all of this stuff with Afghanistan? Is any of it playing out right now? And let's just zero in on the current operation in Gaza, because the Israeli Defense Forces has said the final stronghold of Hamas is in Gaza City. And so they are going to spend however many months, that's the number they've used, it's going to take so that we can get all of our hostages back and we can finally defeat Hamas. How is that playing out with reality?
Well, I mean, on the same track that we've been talking about, if you go back a year and a half to March of 2024, when Israel was about to put its forces into Rafah, you heard from the Israelis and from the Americans, from the Biden administration, 21 out of 24 Hamas battalions have been destroyed. The last 3 are remaining in Rafah. They've just got to go in there and clean them out, and then this will all be over, right? I mean, we heard that. I don't know if I got the numbers right, but we heard that.
4 battalions.
Right? That's all that was left.
Strongly.
Right, you had Americans and Israelis, Netanyahu. I don't know if Biden ever said it, but I'm sure Blinken said it. You know, I mean, so it's that type of, well, you know, how come the argument isn't being made here, or it's being put forward that this has all been said before? You know, so I mean, as we watch this continuation of the Israeli plan, and the Israelis, I think too, which has confounded a lot of people, they should be in a hurry, but they're not. And their willingness to continue this ethnic cleansing to its conclusion, it might take 2 or 3 more years. But you see their persistence, right? You see their willingness to do it. You see their willingness to abandon the north of Gaza, as they did last year, to be in line with Donald Trump's inauguration ceasefire that lasted for 2 months. And then all the work, all the effort they put in cleansing large parts of the north, and then now having to do it over again, right? They're fine doing that. They have an objective, they have a goal in mind, and they're going to see it through. I don't see anything stopping them. And as we watch what's occurring in Gaza, as the Gaza City, as it is reduced to rubble, you know, their intentions are clear. No, I shouldn't say their intentions are clear. Their concerns, or their lack of concerns, are clear as well. They will go forward doing this. They're taking some casualties, not a lot. They're sustaining. They know that they have the full backing of the United States. The idea that they might be isolated in the world, or continuing to be further isolated in the world, that fits their kind of cosmic, biblical, historical understanding of the universe. That's Israel against everybody. And so this makes sense to them.
Yeah, there it is, the headline you can see right here. This is from June 2024. The IDF on track to dismantle Hamas's last brigade in Rafah.
Right, and that was repeated across media. I mean, you heard that throughout the American media, how this is the last thing. If they, I mean, NPR, you know, you hear like, yeah, that 20 out of 24 battalions have been destroyed. So if you're a person driving, you're thinking, okay, let them just reduce, you know, listening to the radio, hearing that from NPR. Okay, all right, that makes sense. They've achieved all that. They've destroyed 20 out of 24 battalions. Wow, you know, they've really done a lot here. 5/6 or whatever it is. My math is right. Okay, so they've got to do 4 more. That sounds reasonable to me. Okay, so maybe they're not committing a genocide. NPR is saying that they've got a military objective here and they're achieving military results. So maybe there isn't a genocide going on. Maybe this is just the cost of war that we're seeing play out. Maybe it is, you know, propagandists and so on and so forth. And the fact that a year and a half later, as you know, those arguments are being, you know, again used, the pushback isn't there. You know, the skepticism, the willingness of the American media, it's better than it was 2 years ago, but it's still quite abhorrent.
And I don't know, by the way, if you saw, which could be one thing that might be different. Day before yesterday, President Trump sat down with Emmanuel Macron on the sidelines of the UNGA, and they were talking about a lot of stuff about the Russia-Ukraine war primarily. But one of the things that really animated Macron is that he said, yes, we have declared support for a Palestinian state, or we've recognized it, etc. And one of the things that he got really animated about was he said, when this thing started, Israel said, here's the number of Hamas fighters. And now almost 2 years later, this the same number, because which you and I have talked about on so many occasions on this show, even, that every time you kill one guy and then you kill all these innocent family members, you just created more than you destroy. So that makes sense to us. But even Macron is saying that out loud, but that never got, I didn't see that get picked up anywhere else. I watched the exchange. We've actually shown it on here, but I haven't seen any headlines to talk about that. So it completely undermines the narrative. And yet the narrative predominates that.
Right. You see, it reminds me, a guy named Felix Kuhn, who actually lived in Afghanistan in Kandahar, did great work there, journalist and writer. He one time, because, you know, for years you heard how many Al-Qaeda are left in Afghanistan, less than 100. And, you know, I mean, like, and he went through the press reports and he calculated year by year how many supposed Al-Qaeda were killed. You know, because they would just label people Al-Qaeda, and they weren't Al-Qaeda. You know, they were, you know, but you know, it just shows demonstrating the total fallacy, the total, all the deceit here, that your numbers don't even add up. Like you're saying with Hamas, Danny, okay, they've killed how many fighters and how many are now? How did that happen? You know, and so as well as too, you see an unwillingness of the American media to do a tenth of what the Israeli media does. You know, the Israeli media is nothing to hold a torch for, but they at least publish leaks. They at least speak with Israeli whistleblowers. You know, of course, we had a few weeks ago, the Israeli database revealed that the Israeli army itself believes it's killed at least 83% of the people they've killed have been civilians, right? That's the Israeli army database. That was published by the Israeli media. I have not seen that repeated anywhere in American media. I've not seen it. Maybe I've missed it, but I've not seen it.
I haven't seen it.
Right. I mean, so over and over again, you see the Israeli media, or I'm sorry, excuse me, the American media being more compliant with the Israeli government than the Israeli media itself. And that's got to do with the Israelis requiring the American media to go through their military censors, which is something that you would expect if CNN or New York Times had to clear through a military censor in any country. There would be a note at least attached to the article saying this had to go through the Israeli military censors. I've never seen that. I've never seen that. It's only because of journalists who are not part of the established media, the corporate media, that we even know that there are military censors like that. You know, I mean, so the fact that we're here at this point, again, you look back at the history of this, and it makes total sense, because when did they stand up? Even the idea that the journalists in Vietnam were adversarial is way overblown. It's really overblown. I mean, the journalism during the Vietnam War was equally as compliant for many years. It's not until you get into the Nixon administration, I think, that journalists really start to become somewhat adversarial, and that's probably more of a personal animus towards Nixon and Kissinger than out of any duty to report the truth. Similar to, I think, now, where you'll see adversarial journalism because the journalists dislike Trump. He's not the kind of guy who would have been at their cocktail party, kind of thing. You know,
right.
I mean, these journalists.
So let me ask you this: is there because the things are a little bit changing now? Let's say at the 2-year mark, as we near the 2-year mark, because you do have at the UN General Assembly, you've had a number of heads of state say, yes, there's a genocide going on. You, of course, have, I think the last number I saw was 156 nations have supported a Palestinian statehood. Now, a lot of that is just as deep as paper, but it is on paper, and that hadn't existed before. And do you think there's any hope at all in that, maybe different from even the Afghan wartime to now, is the proliferation of shows like this, where you have alternative media that is not compliant with whatever they're told to do, and there is other alternatives? Are we seeing a slight shift, or do you think that the powers that be are still going to be able to withstand it?
I think the assumption by the powers that be are that they will be able to withstand it. Certainly the Israeli perspective, they understand this as well as we do. They understand where their weapon stocks are, you know, where their economy is, where their manpower issues with their forces are. They understand all that. But they also are imbued with a righteousness, again, that comes from their biblical cosmic understanding of the universe, right? That this is how history is supposed to be, but also too, the belief that the Americans are going to stand by them regardless. And as long as they have the Americans, they don't look, their economy go to hell. And this is how the Israelis look at it. Our economy go to hell. Tourists can't show up. I was there 11 months ago. I was in Jerusalem. It was empty. It's crazy, you know, and that's okay. We'll weather it because you know why? We're going to sell bonds, and American states and cities and counties are going to buy these bonds, let alone the rest of the bond market loves us because our bonds are essentially backed by the U.S. government. There's a relatively small debt guarantee program that the United States has maintained since the 90s. I think there's like $4 billion in it right now, which is not a lot. But everybody in the world understands implicitly that the United States is going to back Israel economically, that it won't let it crash. It will bail it out if need be, let alone provide a continuous infusion of support. So, I mean, they have that, right? So what else do they need? Kind of, you know, it's like the old saying, if God is against us, if God's with us, who can be against us? If the United States is with us, then who cares who's against us? I think that's how the Israelis look at it. And, you know, where I see on our side, you know, with Gaza, I think there's nothing's going to stop the Israelis and the Americans from seeing Gaza through to completion. Doesn't mean we have to accept it. Doesn't mean we have to like it. Doesn't mean we still have, we should stop resisting in whatever way we can. The West Bank is a different story, though. The West Bank, I think there's still time to support the Palestinian resistance to make the West Bank annexation. That's coming. Something that the Israelis will regret and ultimately lose. I think there's still time to do that. Whereas in Gaza, you know, unfortunately, I think the writing is on the wall. We don't have to accept it or don't have to like it or any of that. But I think that's the reality of it. But the West Bank, I think there's time to support the resistance there in a variety of different ways that and makes the annexation of the West Bank a terrible mistake by the Israelis.
Well, we can only hope so. And we can only do what we can do. We're going to bring it to light. It's one of the reasons we love having you on the show, because you don't pull any punches. You just say things the way they are. We're going to continue to put you on the air and to say the same kind of things ourselves. And then I guess it is up to God. Whatever happens does happen at that point. We'll see whose side eventually he turns out to be on, I guess. But listen, all we can do is tell the truth, and we're really grateful for you coming on and sharing this. And by the way, everybody be sure and go see Bodyguard of Lies. You see Gary's rolling that across the bottom right there. Documentary on Paramount Plus right now. Do not miss it. Matthew Ho, I'm sure he'll sign autographs if you ask him. So
Sure thing. Sure thing. Yeah, yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, folks. We appreciate you, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.